A man abandoned his daughter in the scorching desert simply because he couldn't accept having a daughter. In a vast desert of the American Southwest, where the arid land and endless dunes served as a stage for lives shaped by trials and legends, Sierra was born, a girl whose very existence had been marked by cruel, arbitrary abandonment. From her first breath, she was branded by the merciless act of James, her father, whose beliefs were rooted in old superstitions and the notion that only sons could carry on a lineage's weight and honor, relegating daughters to a burden unfit to preserve the family legacy. So it was, on a sweltering day, that James left Sierra in the heart of the desert, convinced that by doing so he was safeguarding his reputation and the family's future, even if it meant severing one of his own blood ties. This desert, a place of extremes and constant change, became the setting where Sierra's fate would unfold. Amid shifting sands and piercing winds, she was discovered by Ms. Margaret, an elderly woman who lived in a modest cabin on the outskirts of a small settlement called Suncross. Known for her ancestral wisdom and her ability to perceive what lies in the world's shadows, Ms. Margaret took Sierra in with empathy and a protective instinct, teaching her the mysteries of the dunes, the secrets of the wind, and the knowledge the desert reveals only to those who are willing to listen. From that encounter, Sierra learned that the desert was not merely a place of punishment, but also a realm where transformation and renewal can arise from even the harshest adversities. As she grew older, Sierra came to understand that the abandonment she had suffered was not merely a stroke of fate, but the starting point for her journey of self-discovery and metamorphosis. Forged by suffering and solitude, she awakened to a special gift, the ability to hear the whispers of the wind and interpret the shifting sands. That talent set her on a path of defiance against a past ruled by prejudice, proving that apparent frailty can give rise to unshakable strength. Supported at every step by Ms. Margaret, Sierra learned to transform the bitterness of her abandonment into wisdom, discovering that desert rituals and traditions can be reinterpreted to usher in a new era, one in which human worth is not measured by gender, but by the depth of spirit and the courage to confront the world's storms. Over the course of her journey, Sierra embraced these ancestral teachings and lessons from the desert in order to rebel against the restraints imposed by outdated superstitions. She understood that James's act, abandoning her in the desert, cruel as it was, sparked an immense drive in her to prove that human essence transcends labels and socially imposed conventions. Roaming the vast stretches of sand, Sierra found unexpected sources of vitality, small flowering plants emerging in unlikely spots, modest oases and natural havens that stood as living metaphors of resilience. Her profound connection to the land helped her realize that the desert, for all its bleakness, harbors the seed of new hope, the same hope that was born with her, even if it sprang from abandonment. As the years went by, Sierra's tale evolved into the living legend of a girl who defied the cruel logic of prejudice and remade herself into a figure of light and resilience. Every teaching she received, every word from Ms. Margaret, became a building block in the creation of her new identity. The past was reinterpreted, and the present shone with the promise of a future where people's worth could no longer be measured by ancient customs. The residents of Suncross came to see Sierra as a symbol of renewal and triumph, evidence that abandonment can be transformed into a power so potent it can touch and soften even the hardest of hearts. She reconciled with her destiny, recognizing that James's act was just one chapter in a larger story, in which the safeguarding of her own spirit would become the true legacy to be passed on. Through rituals and practices learned from the wise, Ms. Margaret, the young woman, incorporated elements of nature and tradition to create a new way of life, one that blended the desert's mysticism with the resilience demanded by such a harsh environment. This transformation not only rebuilt her own identity, but also encouraged the community to rethink its values and leave behind its outdated views. Sierra showed that by transforming pain into insight, one can face even the hardest challenges and emerge stronger, not in spite of the scars, but because of them. One morning, with a gentle breeze blowing, Sierra knelt in the sand and gazed at the rippling horizon. Her fingers, calloused by time and hard work, brushed over the warm surface, sensing the faint vibrations that few could perceive. The young woman, now 15, carried in her eyes the weight of memories that were not her own but which had been handed down by Ms. Margaret's stories under starry skies. These were memories of a people who learned to wring life from scarcity, turning hardship into inner abundance. "The desert speaks to those who know how to listen," Ms. Margaret would often say, while preparing ointments and medicines from the rare plants that survived nearby. "It teaches us that life persists, even when everything seems dead." Sierra closed her eyes and let the wind caress her face. She felt a persistent ache in her chest whenever she thought of James, the man who had abandoned her simply for not being the son he had wanted, one who, shackled by ancient beliefs and unfounded fears, would sooner sever ties with his own daughter than risk the scorn of his peers. Sierra tried not to nourish resentment, for Ms. Margaret had taught her that hatred is like a poison you drink, hoping the other person will die. What he did was an act of cowardice, she murmured to herself, standing up and brushing the sand off her simple clothes. Yet his cowardice led me here to Ms. Margaret, to the heart of this desert, to my true self. Her words were lost on the wind, but their meaning endured, taking root in Sierra's spirit like the deep roots of a desert plant that refuses to yield to barrenness. She walked back toward the cabin she shared with her mentor, a humble structure of stone and wood that sheltered more warmth than any opulent mansion. Along the way, she gathered some of the rare herbs peeking from between rocks, a precious offering from the desert to those who know how to search. Mrs. Margaret waited by the door, her body bent by the weight of many years, but her eyes still shining with wisdom and kindness. The old woman watched Sierra approach and smiled, perceiving in her a strength even abandonment could not crush. "The wind has a different feel today," the elder remarked as Sierra drew near. "It carries news of change." "What kind of change, Ms. Margaret?" the girl asked, handing over the newly gathered herbs. "The sort that tests what we've learned," answered the elder cryptically, gazing at the horizon. "Tomorrow, some traders will arrive in the settlement traveling from far away. They say one among them is a man searching for something he lost many years ago." A chill ran down Sierra's spine, a sudden intuition beyond words. "James," she whispered, more to herself than to be heard. Ms. Margaret neither confirmed nor denied this guess. She simply took Sierra's hands in her own, imparting silent strength. "The desert teaches us everything in its own time. Dunes shift, oases dry up and return, storms blow over. Everything comes around again, one way or another." That night, Sierra couldn't sleep. She lay awake on her simple mat, restless and uneasy. Through the tiny window, she watched the bright desert stars and wondered if they were the same ones illuminating James's path. The man who had condemned her to die, but who had, in a cruel twist, also guided her to the most authentic life she could have had. At dawn, a caravan of traders arrived in Suncross. The men and women, their skin baked by the sun, brought colorful fabrics, aromatic spices, handcrafted jewelry, and other rare goods from distant lands, capturing the fascination of the locals. Following Ms. Margaret's instructions, Sierra went to the small market to sell some medicinal potions they had prepared over the past few days. Among the visitors, one middle-aged man stood out, his eyes seeming to bear the heaviness of many seasons. He moved slowly, as though searching for something beyond the items laid out before him. When his gaze locked with Sierra's, there was a moment of mutual recognition, though they had never met. It was recognition on a level deeper than memory, touching the core of their beings. He stepped up to the table where Sierra displayed her natural remedies. His eyes scanned the small glass bottles of colorful liquids, the pouches of dried herbs, the ointment stored in ceramic pots. "These medicines, who makes them?" he asked, his voice rasping with hesitation. "Me and my adoptive mother," Sierra replied, maintaining her composure despite her pounding heart. "She taught me everything about the desert's plants." "Your adoptive mother?" The man frowned slightly, a shadow passing over his face. "You never knew your real parents?" The question lingered, laden with hidden significance. Sierra felt her throat tighten but forced herself to speak with dignity. "My father abandoned me in the desert when I was born because I was a girl. Ms. Margaret found me and raised me as her own." The words hit the man like arrows hitting their mark. He swayed a little, bracing himself on the makeshift table, and Sierra noticed his trembling hands. "I knew a man," he began at last, voice heavy with regret, "who made that same terrible mistake. He left his newborn daughter in the desert, blinded by superstition and terrified of others' judgment." "What became of him?" asked Sierra, managing to keep her tone steady despite her tumult of emotions. "He spent his life tormented by that act," the stranger replied, his eyes boring into hers with unsettling intensity. "With each year that passed, the guilt grew inside him, devouring him like a slow poison. He lost his wife, who never forgave him, not even on her deathbed. He lost the respect of the community when the truth came out. But worst of all, he lost the chance to watch his daughter grow, to hear her voice, to teach her about life." "It sounds like he reaped what he sowed," Sierra observed, feeling a conflicting surge of both pity and resentment. "Yes," the man agreed, lowering his head. "Now he wanders from place to place seeking absolution he likely won't find." At that moment, Ms. Margaret approached, her steps slow as she leaned on her cane. Her wise eyes took in the scene, understanding immediately what was transpiring. "I see you've already met," she remarked with a voice that bore the calm of many years. "Not formally," the man replied, straightening with visible effort. "My name is James." The name reverberated in Sierra's ears like an echo of some old prophecy. This was the moment she had secretly imagined for years, a confrontation between her past and her present, between the abandoned child and the woman she had become through adversity. "I'm Sierra," she answered simply, watching the impact of her words cross the man's face. James paled, his eyes welling with barely contained tears. "Sierra," he repeated quietly, as though savoring the syllables of a long-lost name. "Your mother chose that name before she passed from this world." A loaded silence settled over them, thick with unspoken questions and accusations. Ancient wounds mingled with fresh pains. Miss Margaret broke it, inviting James to her cabin so they could talk more privately. The walk to the modest dwelling passed in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. The desert wind whipped around them, stirring up little swirls of sand as though trying to erase the footprints of the past. Once they arrived, the elderly woman brewed a tea from rare herbs, pouring it into clay bowls worn by time. "The desert has its own way of tying up loose ends," Ms. Margaret said as she settled heavily onto an old cushion. "It separates, so it may later bring together, just as its storms scatter seeds so they can sprout in unexpected places." James cradled the bowl in his hands, staring into the amber liquid without truly seeing it. "All these years," he finally said, his voice trembling, "I believed my daughter was dead. I convinced myself that was easier, that the desert had shown her more mercy than I did." "And why have you come for her now?" asked Sierra, unable to keep the bitterness from her tone. "Because I discovered that a life without forgiveness is too heavy a burden," he answered, raising his eyes to hers. "I haven't come expecting you to forgive me, Sierra. I know my act was unforgivable. I only came so you'd know that your father has regretted it every single day, every hour, every breath, since that awful moment. You're not my father," Sierra said, the words sharp as broken glass. "A father protects, nurtures, guides. You were just the instrument that brought me into this world, then left me to my own fate." James lowered his head, receiving her accusation as though it were a well-deserved sentence. "You're right," he admitted humbly. "I don't deserve that title. I was a coward, a weak man consumed by superstition and fear of what people would say. Traditions can be cruel if misunderstood," Ms. Margaret interjected in her calm, measured voice. "But they can also be reshaped. The same desert that nearly took Sierra's life also saved her, through the ancient knowledge that I was able to pass on." James regarded the old woman with boundless gratitude. "How can I thank you for what you've done? You rescued and Raised my daughter when I'd condemned her. Don't thank me, Miss Margaret replied with a serene smile. Thank the desert and its mysteries. I merely listened to what it told me. Sierra observed their exchange, feeling her heart torn between the anger she had nurtured for so long and an unexpected compassion budding like a rare plant in the dry ground. She no longer saw James as the monster from her childhood nightmares, but as a man broken by his own mistake, consumed by guilt and regret. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her gaze unwavering. "Only what you're willing to offer," he said sincerely. "I came here to see you, to know you're alive and well, to tell you how sorry I am, and that if I could go back and undo my cruelty, I would." His words hung in the air like dust motes suspended in the sun's rays filtering through the cabin walls. Sierra felt a tightness in her throat, a swirl of emotions she couldn't name. Part of her wanted to scream, to banish him from her life, to make him suffer as she had, but another part recognized in him the same pain she carried, albeit for different reasons. "The desert teaches us that even the worst droughts must end eventually," Ms. Margaret said, breaking the tense silence. "And when the storms have passed, the toughest plants bloom with renewed vigor." Sierra understood the message hidden in her mentor's words. Forgiveness was not mandatory, but it was possible, a choice that could free her as much as it might free James. It was a seed that, if planted now, could sprout when the time was right. "I can't forgive you today," she said, finally meeting the gaze of the man who had left her behind. "Maybe I never will entirely, but I'm willing to learn why you did it, and maybe one day find peace with it." James nodded, tears flowing down his sun-worn face. "That's more than I deserve," he whispered, bowing in humble respect. In the days that followed, a fragile dialogue took root between father and daughter. James remained in Suncross, staying in a small inn and visiting Ms. Margaret's cabin daily. Sierra, at first reluctant, slowly allowed herself to learn about the story of this man, his upbringing, his beliefs, his mistakes, and how they had shaped him. He spoke of his youth, of how he'd been raised to think that only sons could continue a family's legacy. He described his wife, Sierra's mother, a kind-hearted woman who, unable to forgive him for abandoning their daughter, died from sorrow soon after. He recounted the years of torment that followed, when the weight of his actions drove him to a wandering existence, searching for redemption. Sierra listened in silence, letting his words settle in her heart, not to justify the abandonment, but to comprehend the context that led to it. She realized that James, much like herself, was a product of the desert, shaped by hardship, fashioned by scarcity, and changed by hardships endured. One particularly scorching afternoon, the three of them walked together to a small oasis hidden among the dunes, a secret place known only to Ms. Margaret and Sierra. There, beneath the scant shade of a few palm trees beside a trickle of clear water, the old woman proposed a ritual of healing, not to erase the past, but to honor it as part of a broader path. "The desert never forgets," she said, mixing herbs and essential oils with careful motions. "It records each footprint, each tear, every drop of blood spilled on its soil. But it also transforms everything into something new." With practiced gestures, the old woman anointed James's and Sierra's foreheads with the fragrant mixture, murmuring ancient words of power. "This is a ritual of recognition," she explained, "not to make you forget, but to help you accept. What happened can't be undone, but it can be woven into the greater tapestry of your lives." Father and daughter regarded each other through the ritual markings, seeing each other in a new light. There was no miraculous instant of complete reconciliation, only a small step toward mutual understanding, a silent recognition that both had survived, each in their own way. In the months that followed, James chose to remain in Suncross. He built a modest shack on the outskirts, never trying to force his presence on Sierra, but wanting to be near in case she ever wished to know him better. Gradually, he became part of the community, offering his skills as a metal worker, something he had picked up during his wandering years. Sierra, watching him quietly integrate, felt conflicting emotions. Some days, anger still bubbled within her at the memory of his cruelty. On other days, She caught herself feeling an odd compassion for this man and recognized he was waging the same fight for redemption that she, too, had undertaken all these years. One night, a vicious sandstorm battered Suncross. The townsfolk barricaded themselves indoors against the raging elements. Sierra and Ms. Margaret prepared for the long night, lighting lanterns and checking their supplies of water and food. A frantic knock on the door interrupted them. A neighbor, breathless and terrified, blurted out, "Old James left to gather wood before the storm hit, and he hasn't come back. No one's seen him since." Worry clenched Sierra's heart, a concern she never expected to feel for him. She looked at Ms. Margaret, who nodded gravely. "You know these dunes better than anyone," the elder said. "If anyone can find him in this storm, it's you." Sierra hesitated only a moment. Despite everything, she couldn't leave James to fend for himself, repeating the same abandonment she herself had once suffered. That would mean perpetuating the cycle of suffering. "I'll go," she decided, throwing on heavy cloaks and wrapping a makeshift turban around her head and face. "Miss." Margaret stopped her for a moment, handing over a small amulet fashioned from bone and feathers. "So the wind won't wipe away your path," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Sierra stepped into the tempest, facing the desert's fury with the resolve of someone raised in its harsh embrace. The wind howled around her, sand stinging every inch of exposed skin. But she pressed on, guided by a sense that transcended logic. She found James half buried in sand between two dunes, partially unconscious, but still breathing. With superhuman effort, Sierra dragged him to a natural rock formation that offered a little shelter from the storm. There, safe from the onslaught, she used her healing knowledge to tend the wound on his head, likely from a fall, tearing strips of her own cloak for bandages, applying ointments she carried for emergencies, and quietly reciting the desert chants Ms. Margaret had taught her. When James finally regained consciousness, his eyes locked onto Sierra's with equal parts surprise and gratitude. "Why?" he croaked, voice hoarse. "Why risk your life for me after what I did?" Sierra paused before responding. "Because the desert taught me that real strength doesn't come from returning evil for evil, but from ending the cycle," she finally said. "And because, whether we like it or not, there's a bond between us that even abandonment couldn't completely break." Tears slipped from James's tired eyes. "I never deserved a daughter like you," he whispered. "It's not a matter of deserving," Sierra answered, surprising herself with the clarity of her own words. "It's about choosing to be something other than what our past defined for us." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the tiny shelter, father and daughter found a fragile understanding. No full forgiveness, no erasure of what had happened, but a mutual recognition that both were shaped by their choices and hardships, and that the desert, in its inscrutable wisdom, had brought them back together. When dawn finally arrived and the storm passed, Sierra helped James to his feet. Slowly, they made their way back to Suncross, where Ms. Margaret waited anxiously. She watched them approach, the young woman lending her strength to the injured old man, and smiled, seeing her lifetime of teachings confirmed. The desert breaks, apart only to bring us together, destroys only so that something new may rise. Over the following years, James remained in Suncross, never trying to claim a fatherly role he knew he didn't deserve, but gradually forging a different bond with Sierra, one built on mutual respect, acceptance of the past's wounds, and hope for a future with less cruelty. Sierra's story, an abandoned girl who rose to extraordinary strength, spread to nearby towns, becoming a legend that inspired other women to challenge obsolete beliefs and unearth their own hidden power. She continued her studies with Miss Margaret and, in time, became a guardian of the desert's secrets herself, a revered healer who turned suffering into knowledge and shared her gift with all who sought her help. The desert, silent witness to her life, went on molding destinies. With its relentless beauty, its ever-shifting dunes reflected the truth Sierra had learned in her very being. Nothing is permanent, everything is in motion, and even the cruelest trials can nurture a resilience that blossoms in the midst of the harshest surroundings. Thus, The girl cast out for being born a daughter became the woman who saved and transformed, proving that a person's true value has nothing to do with gender, lineage, or tradition, but with the ability to draw light from darkness, water from dry, ground hope from the depths of despair. And in accomplishing this, she found not only her own redemption, but offered the possibility of redemption to the one who once condemned her. Sierra, child of the desert, became a name whispered reverently by travelers who ventured across the sweeping plains of sand, a symbol that even in utter desolation, the most resilient hope can flourish. Her story echoed among the dunes, carried on the unyielding wind, reminding all who heard it that the true legacy of a person is not dictated by blind tradition, but by the courage to rewrite one's own fate, to transform scars into badges, of honor and loss into an inexhaustible wellspring of wisdom. As the seasons passed, the tiny settlement of Suncross began to change. Inspired by Sierra's example, its people questioned the old beliefs that had limited women's roles in their community. Girls who had once been confined to household tasks began learning new trades, joining in community decisions, and receiving the same education as boys. The process was slow, met with resistance, but it was as inevitable as shifting dunes that subtly reshaped the landscape. Ms. Margaret, well advanced in years, observed these transformations with bright satisfaction. During her sleepless nights, seated in front of her cabin under a blanket of stars, she silently thanked the desert for using her time-worn body and weathered hands to bring about a greater change. She knew her own time was drawing to a close, that soon she would become part of the very desert she had served her whole life. The knowledge brought her not fear, but a profound sense of peace. "The cycle completes itself," she would whisper, gazing at the thin crescent moon over the dunes. "What was abandoned comes back. What was broken is repaired. What once seemed dead is reborn in new forms." In the quiet stillness of early morning, Ms. Margaret passed from the world as gently as she had lived. Finding her mentor's lifeless body, Sierra did not succumb to despair. Instead, she honored the transition with an ancient ritual Ms. Margaret had taught her. She bathed the old woman's body in water scented with rare herbs, wrapped it in cloth dyed with natural pigments, and buried it, not in an ordinary grave, but in the heart of a particular dune where Ms. Margaret always said the spirits of the desert were at their most potent. At sunset, when the funeral took place, all of Suncross gathered to pay their respects to the woman who had offered healing and wisdom to so many. James stood among them, quietly reflecting on the complexity of his emotions, gratitude toward the woman who had saved and raised his daughter, and a deep sorrow over the path that had brought him to such terrible decisions. After the ceremony, once everyone else had drifted away, Sierra stayed alone by the grave. She noticed, poking through the freshly turned sand, a tiny green shoot, a plant that local lore claimed only bloomed once every generation and had the power to reveal hidden truths. "Your final gift," Sierra whispered, stroking the delicate leaves. "Even in death, you're still teaching." Over the following months, Sierra stepped into the role Ms. Margaret once held. Their cabin, which used to be a private refuge, evolved into a center of healing and learning. Young women from across the region, inspired by Sierra's story, traveled long distances to study desert plants, the arts of healing, and the tale of the girl once abandoned who had managed to bloom. James, now graying and more stooped under the weight of the years, remained a quiet presence in Sierra's mission. He never demanded to be part of her life beyond what she allowed, but he contributed his metalworking skills, crafting special containers for her remedies, delicate tools for harvesting rare herbs, and protective amulets that Sierra gave to travelers braving the desert crossings. One late afternoon, when the sun had dipped low enough to cloak the dunes in red and gold, James came to Sierra with a special request. "I want to visit the place where I abandoned you," he said, his voice trembling. "Not to relive that horror, but to finally confront what I did and maybe leave a piece of this burden behind." Sierra studied the man before her. Not the monster of her nightmares, not the father he never was, but a flawed human being searching for a peace he might never fully find. She felt a compassion that extended beyond formal forgiveness, touching on something more elemental and universal. "We'll go at dawn," she decided after a moment. "It's a long trek, and the midday sun will be too harsh for you now." So, before sunrise the next day, the two set off on camels carrying ample water and dried food. James followed Sierra in respectful silence, noting how confidently she navigated dunes and rock formations, as if she knew the secret patterns of a landscape that appeared empty to outsiders. Hours later, Sierra slowed her camel and finally stopped. She dismounted with ease and waited for James, who struggled with stiff joints. "It's here," she said simply, indicating a small depression between two dunes. "Ms. Margaret once showed me the exact spot where she found me. I was just a few hours old, dehydrated, hardly strong enough to cry." James looked at the spot, and it was as if time had rewound. He recalled every terrible detail of that day: the baby's weight in his arms, the piercing cry that somehow failed to break him out of his delusional resolve, the moment he laid her on the sand and walked away without a backward glance, convinced he was fulfilling some unassailable tradition. "I didn't deserve to be your father," he muttered, dropping to his knees. "I never deserved the blessing you represented." Sierra knelt beside him, not to console him but to share the raw truth of that moment. "For so long, I believed the desert was only a place of abandonment and death," she said, letting her fingers sink into the scorching sand. "But Ms. Margaret showed me it's also a place of transformation. The heat of the sun, the purity of the air, the vastness of the sky. They forged something in us that might never come to light in a gentler place." James lifted his gaze to hers. "You're far stronger than I'll ever be," he said with genuine humility. "You had the courage to save me during that sandstorm, when I never so much as tried to spare my own daughter from some meaningless belief." "It's not a matter of strength or weakness," Sierra told him with the hard-won insight she had gathered. "It's about the choices we make in crucial moments. You chose to follow fear and tradition. I chose Ms. Margaret's lessons of compassion and healing. They remained there as the sun climbed the sky, silent witnesses to a confrontation between the desert's cruelty and its power to redeem. There was no full forgiveness, no instant of erasing the past, only the delicate knowledge that both had been shaped by adversity, and that somehow the desert had reconnected them to close a circle that began at that very spot so many years before. On their return to Suncross, something had subtly shifted in their relationship. They didn't become a conventional family. Those chances were buried on the day of Sierra's abandonment. But they forged a partnership grounded in mutual respect and a deep understanding that transcended simple labels. The years passed, and tales of Sierra's healing powers reached ever more distant lands. Caravans veered off their usual paths to visit Suncross and consult with the daughter of the desert, as she became known. Her story, told around countless campfires in the still of the desert night, inspired other women to cast off old restraints, find their voices, and follow their own paths. James, meanwhile, lived out his final years with a calm he had never thought possible. He continued crafting metal items, tools at first, and later intricate decorative pieces that seemed to capture a quiet story of brokenness and atonement. As his health declined, it was Sierra who looked after him, not out of any imposed obligation, but through a deliberate choice based on a shared understanding of human frailty. On his deathbed, James held Sierra's hand and summoned the last of his strength to speak. "Thank you," he whispered, "for showing me that abandonment doesn't have to be an ending, but can be the beginning of something far greater. You grew and flourished where I saw only desolation, and that's the greatest miracle I've ever witnessed." After his passing, Sierra laid him to rest in the desert, as she had done for Ms. Margaret. This was no act of abandonment, but a gesture of returning him to the elemental force that, in its paradoxical way, had bound their lives together more tightly than either could have imagined. And so, Sierra's story continued through the generations, evolving like the dunes themselves, never static, always shifting. It was no longer just the tale of an abandoned girl, but proof of how human resilience can flourish in even the most parched conditions, how imperfect forgiveness can release both the wounded and the wounder from unseen chains, and how a person's True legacy isn't shaped by blood or archaic rituals, but by the courage to rewrite their own story, transforming scars into emblems of honor and loss into a deep source of wisdom.